Hello everyone. Continuing to take on my social media question list. And today I wanted to talk about the idea of humans seeing fairies or the fairy sight, the ability to see fairies. It's a little bit of a broad topic. I'm mostly going to stay in line with the folkloric concepts relating to this. So not going to get too much into the more sort of new age ideas about how to train your mind to see fairies. I know that can be sort of trendy and popular, not something that I'm super into myself. Usually those ideas, and when you run across like websites and sources that are talking about how to teach yourself to see fairies through meditation or visualization exercises. Most of those are predicated on the idea that fairies are insubstantial energy beings or beings that exist in a separate reality in some way that we have to sort of tune into this sort of, I don't want to say astral because fairies aren't actually on the astral plane. There's a lot of confusion about that. But that's sort of the idea behind it, that you have to teach your mind to connect to this separate reality in order to perceive these non-physical beings, these energy beings, the same way that you'll see people talking about learning how to see auras, that kind of concept. So fair enough. Some people are really into those concepts. That really is not something we find in folklore, and it's not something that's really true to some of the older fairy lore and concepts and ideas about fairies. Now, I'm not saying that there might not be some validity to it or validity to the idea of spiritual journeying or guided meditations to connect to these beings in different ways. That would be a whole separate topic to tackle. But I do want to clarify that for this particular post, when we're looking at the idea of seeing fairies, we're not really going to get into those sort of methods or the idea of everybody being able to train themselves, train their mind, train their abilities to perceive fairies. So consider that my little disclaimer as we start this particular video today. When we are generally talking about the ability to see fairies, the human ability to see fairies, there's sort of three rough categories that we find in the folkloric material and in anecdotal material. The first category, which is really the most straightforward, is the idea that fairies, generally speaking, have an ability called glamour, among other things, that allows them to pass unseen when they choose to, which is the majority of the time. So this means that most of the time there are going to be some sort of otherworldly beings around us, but that most humans are not able to see them or perceive them because the fairies in question choose not to be seen or perceived. So we do see the idea that when many people see or encounter fairies, what's actually happening is that the fairies themselves are choosing to be allowed to be seen. It's sort of a voluntary thing on their part. They could pass invisibly, but for whatever reasons of their own, in that particular moment, in that particular instance, they are allowing themselves to be seen. This is not always a good thing for the person who sees them. We do have some accounts, of course, where they're allowing themselves to be seen for beneficial purposes to the humans or beneficial purposes to the fairies. There are quite a lot of anecdotes and folkloric material where the fairies are pretty clear that in certain instances, particularly relating to the playing of games and in modern times to the fighting of battles between two groups of fairies, that they need a human being. Sometimes it's stated that they need a human being on each side if it's two opposing sides fighting or playing a game. Sometimes they merely need one human being present in order for the game or battle to occur. And in those cases, obviously, they need the human being to actually see them and to be aware of what's going on and what's occurring. So we see multiple accounts of this. I don't want to get too caught up in retelling them, but for one example, there's the idea that when fairies they need to engage in a battle between two groups of fairies, they're going to take a person, a human being who is local to each group. Yeats talks about this in the Celtic Twilight, and each group will fight, not necessarily with the aid of that person, but with that human sort of acting as an anchor. There's some theories that this allows the human being's mortality to affect the fighting group so that they can actually die. I'm a little skeptical of that myself. Basically, we don't know why they need the human, but I'm putting that out there because that is one thing that gets mentioned. Either way, we do know that they require a human, in that case, on each side in order to engage in this battle and fight. We also have accounts, and again, widespread across anecdotes and folkloric material, where the fairies might be engaged in a game such as hurling, and they need a human being to either play in the game with them or witness the game being played in order for them to actually be able to play it. So in those cases, fairies being seen, there's no special ability that's required. There's no, the human isn't doing anything in particular. It's the fairies allowing themselves to be seen. And they can allow themselves to be seen whenever they want to. There's also cases, of course, because I mentioned not all of these are beneficial to the humans, or necessarily the fairies, depending on what the fairies are meaning to do. There are cases, you can find these on the Tuhas.ie website, where a person stumbles across a group of fairies. They're engaged in this particular anecdote and playing a game of ball. The human happens to acknowledge that he can see them, and they proceed to beat him unconscious. So in that case, it does seem like they were allowing themselves to be seen, but they clearly were not doing it to bring anything positive or good to this person. They caused him quite a bit of physical injury. Why did they do that? Really hard to say. Maybe they were bored. Maybe their goal had always been to get a human to do something they considered rude so that they would have an excuse to cause him a physical injury. It's very hard to say. The point being, though, that, just because they allow themselves to be seen is not always a good thing for the human that's seeing them. Catherine Briggs discusses quite extensively in her book, A Dictionary of Fairies and Fairies in Tradition and Lore, the fairy insistence on privacy and on not being acknowledged and not being seen. Generally speaking, if you do happen to see them, whether you think they're allowing themselves to be seen or not, it's usually considered wise not to acknowledge that you can in fact see them. And we'll get back into that in a little bit when we get into more of the folklore and anecdotes about seeing fairies. There are also means by which human beings can see fairies, even if the fairies don't want to be seen. And this sort of breaks down into two sort of subsets in this particular part of the discussion. We have the concept, of course, of humans who are able to gain the ability to see fairies artificially, if you will. One method of doing this, which we see mentioned in folklore in multiple places, is the idea of possessing a four-leaf clover. It's supposed to be able to break any enchantments, so any sort of magical enchantment, any sort of glamour. Glamour is something that's mentioned often in relation to fairies, but it's not exclusive to fairies. There are other types of magic workers, if you will, that can use glamour to disguise the appearance of things, change the appearance of things. So having a four-leaf clover was believed to cut through any sort of visual enchantment, any sort of glamour that was changing the appearance of something so that it could be seen truly. And this also applied to the fairies themselves. If you have a four-leaf clover, it's said, you can see the fairies as they actually appear, even when they wish to pass unseen. Again, you don't necessarily want them to know that you have this or that you are seeing them. Might not end well for you. There's also some mention in different sources of different ointments or different sort of things that humans can manufacture to give themselves this ability. A little skeptical of those as well, but it's a little bit too much to get into here. In the link for the video, in the comments for the video, I'll post a link to an article that came out recently that discusses that in a lot more depth. If you're curious about that aspect of it, you can kind of dig into it for yourselves. Another artificial means of gaining the ability to see fairies, if you yourself do not actually possess it, is to be physically touching a human being who does naturally possess it. And that is sort of getting us into the second part of this subset, which is the idea that certain human beings are born with the innate ability to see ghosts, to see spirits, to see otherworldly beings, whether or not those otherworldly beings want to be seen. It is just an ability that some people have, and it's not necessarily an ability people want to have. In parts of Scotland and some parts of Northern Ireland, this can sometimes be referred to as the second sight. Second sight is a little more complicated than just being able to see spirits. It also has to do with being able to see the future or an awareness of events that have not yet come to pass. So I don't want to simplify it here and make it seem like it's only about seeing spirits and seeing otherworldly things. But that is a part of it, at least in Scotland. From my discussion with some of my friends in Ireland, it seems like in Ireland, the second sight is more strictly just the prognostication and not as much the seeing spirits. So I do want to also clearly differentiate the two there. In either case, Reverend Kirk, in his book, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, does discuss the second sight, not only in relation to sensing the future, but specifically and sort of at some length. It's a very short book, so, you know, at some length, given the length of the book, the ability to use it to see the fair folk, whether they wish to be seen or not. So some human beings have this innate ability. These are people who often sort of struggle with this ability. They may, within their own communities, be considered to be a little bit mad. Madness and the fairies, also closely intertwined. They are often connected to the fairies more deeply than just seeing them. They might converse with them. They might be taken by them, sort of where the expression away with the fairies, touched by the fairies, comes from. And that deeper connection often causes them as many problems or more problems than it might provide helpful things to them. So I do also want to emphasize that this is not necessarily something most people want to have or enjoy having. But that is certainly a way that human beings are able to see the good people. And it's just something some people are born with. You have it from birth. Either you have it or you don't have it. Anyone who's watching this video, if you're old enough to be able to communicate in any way, speak or sign or write or what have you, then you would already know whether you have the natural ability to see the fair folk or not. And this would be see them as the same way you would see other human beings, as solid, real presences in this world, not as little sparkly lights necessarily, or there are other ways to sense them, where you might just sense their presence, or you might have an idea that they're around, but you're not actually physically seeing them. That would be a different sort of thing. It's not what we're talking about in this particular video. So just to be clear, the idea behind being able to gain this ability if you don't have it by touching the person is something we see in both Irish and Scottish anecdotes and material, and even Welsh, I should add. Fairy faith in Celtic countries, there's some Welsh anecdotes that mention this. One of the main methods talked about is standing on the foot of a person who has the sight when they are talking about actively seeing something, so that you can also see it. There is at least one Irish account where someone, a younger girl, I believe she was 10 or 12, wanted to show several of her friends a group of fairies that she saw dancing at a certain time on a certain day every week. So she brought them with her and had them all hold hands. And as long as they were all holding hands and holding her hand, they were able to see what she was seeing. So a little esoteric here, but the idea being that as long as there is some sort of physical contact between the person who does not have this ability and the person who does, the ability can kind of be borrowed or shared. So those are two ways we see to be able to see the fairies. They show themselves voluntarily for whatever purpose, or they can be seen by a human being who either innately has the ability to see them or through some particular tool has the ability to see them. Now, there's a third category when it comes to seeing fairies, and this is one that features in what is probably the most widespread, or one of the most widespread motifs in fairy lore, and that is the idea of the borrowed midwife. And this story basically goes, and you'll find this, by the way, in Irish, Scottish, Welsh, it's just all over Celtic language-speaking countries relating to fairy lore, which is why I say that it's really widespread. There's slight variations of it. It goes in folklore. It appears in more modern anecdotes. There's even a more modern anecdote, I believe, from Cornwall, with a woman who takes a bus to get to the fairies in question, just to show how widespread and how pervasive this particular story is. Anyway, the story goes that there's a midwife who is well known in her particular area, and one night, as she's at home, sitting around, not doing anything in particular, there comes a knock at the door. She goes to answer it and sees a stranger, someone she's never seen before. He tells her that his wife is in labor and he needs her assistance, offers to pay her handsomely, so she agrees to go. The two of them travel. Sometimes in some versions of the story, they travel through some very odd places, like between two close stones, or through total darkness, or through tunnels. Strange things. In some cases, she's riding a horse that's clearly a little otherworldly. Black horse with red eyes is mentioned in some cases. Or, like I said, there's a more modern one where she's riding a bus. So, lots of variations here. Either way, she travels with this particular stranger. They get to the home, which again, there's so many different variations of this. I really can't get into how many ways this home is described, but they get to the home. She goes to attend to the laboring woman. In some cases, she immediately recognizes that the woman is a local girl who is thought to have died. It's another very common fairy motif, the stolen bride, but not always, and it's not how all the stories go. But either way, she assists in the delivery. The baby is born successfully. The mother is fine. The mother is resting. And usually the father then comes up and hands her some ointment and tells her she needs to anoint the baby's eyes. Sometimes that she needs to do this before the baby opens the eyes, other times just that this is something that needs to be done. And usually the midwife thinks this is a little strange, this is not something they normally do, but nonetheless, anoints the baby's eyes with this ointment. And then in most versions of the story, one of her eyes either itches or she gets something in it or something happens so that she reaches up and touches her own eye. There are some variations where she does it intentionally because she's curious and wants to see what this ointment is, just so you know. Either way, as soon as she touches the ointment to her eyes, everything around her immediately changes and she sees it the way that it truly is. So she realizes that she is in fact not where she thought she was, but is actually in a home of the fairies, and that she has just delivered either a fairy baby or a half fairy baby, depending on the version of the story. And because of this, she has the sense not to accept any food or drink that's then offered to her, and basically just asks that she immediately be taken home, which of course the grateful husband agrees to do without a problem, takes her home, pays her what he agreed to pay her. Everything seems fine, but of course it's not, because the midwife then, sometime later, again varies on the story, is at a local fair or a local market and sees the fairy husband. And again, variations in the story. In some cases, she specifically sees him passing unseen in the crowd, often said to be stealing from other people in the market. In other versions, however, she simply sees him in the market or the fair and recognizes him as this strange man who had brought her to this delivery. Not thinking anything of it, she then greets him and asks him how the woman and the baby are doing. He is, of course, very surprised to be greeted, tells her that the woman and baby are fine, but then asks her how it is that she can see him. To which, of course, the midwife replies, well, of course I can see you. Why wouldn't I see you? And he usually then will ask out of which eye she can see him. If it's both eyes, you know, the story will vary a little here. And she will then reveal which eye she touched with the ointment, at which point he immediately blinds her. In some cases, he blinds both her eyes, even if she only touched one. In other cases, he will only blind the one eye that was touched by the ointment. So when they say that fairies take their privacy seriously, they really, really do take their privacy seriously. And, you know, this idea of them having an ointment that can grant the ability to see through their glamour, can grant the ability to see into their world, is a very widespread one. Again, I'm giving the most common version, the most popular with this borrowed midwife, but we actually do see the idea of this fairy sight granting ointment in other stories and other anecdotes as well. Catherine Briggs mentions one in her book Dictionary of Fairies, where a girl is taken into service of a man who lives in a manor house who has a child. And part of her duty as this sort of governess for this child is to anoint the child's eyes with this ointment every day. And of course, she is made to promise that she will never touch her own eyes with the ointment. Eventually, of course, she does, immediately sees that she's actually in a fairy hill surrounded by fairies, lets it slip that she can see all this, and is cast out and fired for her impertinence, basically, and not following directions very well. In that particular story, the girl then goes mad, and back in the human world, spends all of her time wandering around trying to win back the favor of the fairy who cast her out and get back into fairy, which is where she's decided she wants to be. So we do see other places where this fairy ointment pops up. It's not only in the midwife stories, though that's sort of the most well-known place that it appears. So when we look at the idea of fairy sight in folklore, we have these sort of three main places and ways that they appear. We have the idea that fairies can let themselves be seen, not always a good thing for human beings who are seeing them. We have the idea that certain humans are born with the ability to see fairies, or that such an ability can sort of artificially be gained through human means. And we have the idea that there is a special ointment that the fairies possess and that they make that can be applied to the eyes that will then grant whoever has this ointment, whether they're human or fairy, the ability to see through fairy glamour and see through fairy magic. And in all of these cases, the main idea is that this ability to see sort of hinges on that ability to see through glamour, to see through the fairy enchantment that distorts and fools human senses. And, you know, we see this sort of as a pivotal point in a lot of stories and a lot of anecdotes. It's not always a positive thing. It's not always a negative thing. Sometimes it simply is a thing. But it is sort of an important idea that runs through a lot of folklore and a lot of fairy lore. And as I mentioned, one of the main ideas attached to it is that if you happen to be a human being who can see fairies, or who does see fairies, whether it's accidentally or through innate ability, you really don't want to make a big deal about it. Or if you're seeing particular things, you don't want to let it be known that you are seeing them. You don't want to acknowledge that you're seeing them because you don't really know how they're going to react. And sometimes they do react quite violently to being seen because of that sort of emphasis on their privacy and the importance of their privacy to them. Discretion is definitely the better part of valor when it comes to seeing fairies. Unless they are the ones initiating the contact and they are the ones making it clear that they do want to be seen and that they do want to interact with you in some way, it's always better to sort of keep it on the down low, if you will. Not acknowledge that you can see them or that you're aware of them as much as possible, when possible. So, this actually went a little longer than I had planned. I was aiming for 20 minutes and we're coming up on 30. I think I'm going to wrap it here. But that is sort of the folkloric look at seeing fairies. And if anyone has any questions, please put it in the comments. I will post a link to an article that also discusses this and gets a little more into some other human methods to give a person the ability to see fairies. Hopefully you'll find that very interesting. And I will try to make another video soon on another fun fairy topic. Have a great day.